Welcome to One Word Stories. My name is Joanna Zell, and I'm really happy to greet Robert Gibson.
So thank you for having me, Joanna. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, my very, very precious guest. I'm so happy you are joining. Robert, you are known in the intercultural field as a teacher of cross-cultural management at the university in Bologna, also as a very active theater member. You come originally from the UK, where you graduated from the Oxford University, Modern History and Modern Languages. So with this lens, actually, you are diving into the intercultural communication, and this big dive was also your book, released last year, Bridge the Culture Gaps. Robert, thank you very much for accepting my invitation. And immediately, the very first question in your book: why have you decided to tell stories without telling where they take place?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for that very well-informed introduction. It's great to be here. Yes, actually, that's a very good question. What I do in the book, for those of you who don't know it, is I have so-called critical incidents. This is where something remarkable happens, can be a positive or a negative event, and they're normally involving different types of situations, different cultures, different individuals, of course. And I think many intercultural trainers use these, and they're very powerful. What I realized when I was doing actually practical training sessions is that if you say, okay, a Chinese person meets a German, this immediately triggers in the mind of the reader certain connections. They have a particular view, which is natural. It comes from their experience, their childhood, the society in which they live, of this particular nation, Chinese or American or whatever it is. So, of course, it's very important to know some background when you talk about a critical incident, when you talk about a situation. But I found it quite powerful to sometimes, as an experiment, remove this nationality from the situation. Because I found actually sometimes these situations could apply in other contexts with other nations, and they weren't necessarily linked to the nationality. They could be linked to many other cultural elements. So I found that was quite successful. It's not sort of the end product. It's like a training for the mind. For me, it's like a footballer doing some exercises before they play the match and warming up. They're not really playing the match. When you play the match, you might want to know the details. You might want to know the name of the person. You might want to know much more detail about them. But as an exercise to train the mind, to train these cultural skills and this cultural agility that people are talking about, I think this is a really useful thing and quite powerful. And you can even ask the people afterwards, can you imagine where these people might have come from?
Yeah. As I listen to you, it's immediately this idea of escaping the danger of a single story. Yeah, that exactly what you say, that you can ask afterwards, what do you think? Where do the actors come originally from? And then it's very possible that people would have a couple of ideas and not necessarily two different countries that they would be used in this story from the very beginning.
Actually, you've just stimulated me to think of something else which happened to me last week, actually. I was in London. As you may know, my wife is Chinese, and they've just opened in London a branch of a Chinese hot pot restaurant, which is a very famous brand all over China, and they're now expanding worldwide. And as a treat, we said, well, we're going to go to this hot pot restaurant in Piccadilly Circus in London, and she was quite amazed how authentic it was. And there were a lot of Asian faces there, a lot of Chinese people there. The waitresses were from China, and the waiters. And I was sort of fascinated by this because it seemed like I was in a different world there. I was not in London as I know it, but I was in this extremely, the menu was in Chinese. Everything seemed, I thought I could be in China. Anyway, I thought I would just I just wanted to share this with my followers on LinkedIn, and I just posted this picture, and I didn't think anybody would particularly be in. And I said, where do you think this is? And why do you think it's there? And it got amazing responses. I think, I don't know, 6,000 or 7,000 people looked at it, and lots of comments and a lively discussion and all sorts of interpretations. It was wonderful. I mean, I was overwhelmed by the response. And as you say, there were many stories, and somebody was convinced it was somewhere in Australia. They even wrote the address down. This is and of course, you couldn't really tell from my picture where it was in London.
Yeah.
For me, the interesting thing was not the answer asking this question, where is it? I mean, somebody actually guessed that because they knew about my travel plans, and maybe I wouldn't be in China yet, but I would be in London and so forth. But it was really about the people's using their observation skills and seeing, well, what do I notice in this? And people quickly came across the brand. It wasn't mentioned, but the logo was on one of the serviettes or on the table somewhere. And very interesting interpretations. People came, it triggered off lots of things. It told us more about the people who responded than it did about the actual picture, really. And I was fascinated. So as you say, what I'm trying to do is to not look for one answer, but say, let's just see what the multiple perspectives are. And I think that's the fascinating thing about intercultural training and looking at cultures, is when we start seeing, you can see things, the same thing, like this picture or like this critical incident in the book, in different ways.
Exactly. Yeah, I immediately also have to think of this quote by Anais Nin: "You don't see the world as it is, but as you are." Yeah.
That is such a powerful statement. That, to me, sometimes when I say that at the end of maybe a 2 or 3 day intercultural training session, people are a bit sort of frustrated. They say, well, I wanted to know about this culture. And I said, well, no, you'll learn about yourself, actually. If you learn anything, you're not going to, I don't think we can really understand other cultures, but we can start to understand ourselves. And that's what this exploration, I think, is about.
Definitely. Of course, we need a little bit of input from the outside world, what might be offensive in different corners of the world, what are the expectations regarding our behavior, how to show respect. Definitely, yes. Nevertheless, I completely agree that it shouldn't be the goal to know as much and and to read as much, but rather to experience as much as possible, and to also see how we react to different situations and learn from these reactions.
Yeah.
So the self-reflection is very, very important. And this is also something that brings me to, this filters all of us we have.
Yeah.
Many people call it cognitive biases. Some people, as both of us know, have been using this term of unconscious biases, which is a little bit tricky. Of course, when we work with stories, we have to be aware of the fact that people would listen to the stories with these biases. And you are also writing about biases in your book, and I wanted to ask you how you see it in this process of story listening.
I think this is a really also a very interesting area. It's something that I suppose I've been dealing with for some years, but I got really very interested in it about 5 or 6 years ago when I was asked to run workshops on so-called unconscious bias, and as part of a big program in a corporate setting. And I said, I'm not quite sure what that is. Tell me, what are we doing? And they sent me a link to a test called the implicit association test. And I thought, well, this is, I don't know what's going on here, and I was told that I had a bias I did the test, which you can do on various dimensions of diversity. And the one I did was East and West Germany. And I had a bias towards East Germany, apparently, as a result of this test. So I wasn't sort of quite convinced by the idea. But then I got very intrigued when I started to work with people who had much more knowledge about neuroscience and how the brain works. And this is what I found fascinating. And I think it's Google who claimed that actually every second we get 11 million so-called bits of information that we're confronted with, but we can only really process about 40 of this 11 million, so a tiny amount. So what do? We have to filter that information. I mean, the other reason behind this is that the brain itself apparently, and the brain is not actually much of the body mass. I think it's 2% of the body mass of our adult body is the brain, but it uses, some people say, about 20% of our energy. So this explains why when we're working hard and using the brain a lot, we want to eat chocolate or get sugar or whatever, because we're using a lot of energy. It's actually using more energy than a bigger organ like the liver. So actually what the brain is trying to do the whole time is save energy. It wants to go into this sort of energy saving mode. And so it naturally then filters that information. This has been beautifully described by the Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about two different ways of thinking. So this is a very long explanation for your question. When we listen to a story or when we read a story, we are filtering information quite a lot. And we're connecting things with our experience. So each person has their own individual experience, of course, throughout their life. This is the experience they have with their family, the experience they have in education, in society, in different places all over the world, in different settings. And it means that we all have our own set of lenses and filters that we apply. So when we read a story and we hear about maybe a man with glasses and blonde hair, and perhaps we think of that teacher we had at school who had blonde hair and glasses just like these ones. And that can be a happy memory. That was a great teacher. Or it could be a negative experience. Oh, that was the teacher who was very strict, who didn't give me very good marks at school, who was unfair or whatever. So when we read a story, we hear a story, we're triggered, and all those associations are set off in our minds. It's a bit like this picture that I mentioned before. The different people saw different things in the picture. What do we notice? What do we remember? What do we associate with those people? And some of these associations are culturally determined. They come not from us as an individual, but from the group that we're in. So this is, I think, fascinating about how perhaps what the writer or the speaker of the story had in mind may be interpreted in a completely different way according to the people's cultural filters or cognitive biases or whatever that they have.
Definitely, yes. And when I think of, different speeches, presentations we listen to, of course, there are these moments when our brain is triggered in this positive way. Wow, he's thinking exactly the way I do about it. Yeah. And also maybe our cognitive confirmation bias kicks in. And then there are these moments when we are triggered in the more negative way, as you have just said. And it also costs our brain energy. We have to kind of use this energy to make meaning, to still keep listening to the person and reject judging. So it's pretty complex process that is happening in our head.
That's a very important point about judging, because as is described in this book that I mentioned by Daniel Kahneman, some of our reactions are automatic, and if it's very important, because when we have to do things automatically, because we can't just rethink everything all the time. So we do things like brush our teeth or something, you don't think about it that much. But if you go to the dentist and they tell you you need to be more careful, then you go into a more reflective mode. Okay, I need to brush my teeth for longer. And this is the thing we need to be aware of, that often our reactions are, most of the time, are automatic. And if it's something very important, like if we're involved, for instance, with selecting people to work with us in a job interview or something, we need to go much more into this second slow mode, of this reflective mode. We have to say, okay, let's take a step back and think about that. and also reflect about why am I triggered by this particular word or this particular thing. I had a bit of an allergy when people told me you must do something. In Germany, I had a boss, who said, I said, I don't think I want to do that. He said, you must do that. And then I did everything to avoid this. And I realized that that was maybe a culturally determined reaction of mine, because he had a perfect right to tell me to do something. He was my boss, and he was quite right. It was in my job description to do this. But I was triggered somehow by the way I've been brought up. Don't be ordered around by other people, and maybe a different concept of a boss than he had. He thought, okay, my job is to give instructions, and my idea of a boss was somebody who just sort of coordinates things and gets people to do things and motivates people in a different way. So these triggers are set off by very simple words sometimes, and that's why sometimes when people get emails, then you get an email and you think, and it can be just one line. And no way. And you delete it, or you react, or you, what they call flame, you react emotionally to this email.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. This is, of course, also, this never-ending story in our field. What can explain the situation best? Either the individual upbringing, or so maybe character, or whatever influences, or the culture. Yeah, and again, in your book, you are emphasizing all over again, hey, it's always the combination of different aspects. You cannot really say either or.
Yeah, that's very, very important to me, because I think it's quite easy for people, and I can understand that. It's an easy way to say, oh, he did that because he's British or German or Polish or whatever. Yeah, that's a bit of an easy way out. Actually, it's much more complex than that, as you know. And the image I use is the idea of the intercultural cocktail, saying actually any situation that you're in, first of all, you need to think about the context you're in, the whole context. Are we in, we behave differently in the pandemic from what we behave in the non-pandemic times, for instance, or we behave differently on holiday from when we in the office. And then you have a particular balance between the individual's own absolutely unique personality, because nobody has the same experience that they come up with or the same personality. And then you have the element of the culture. Culture is, for me, not just national culture, as you know, but it's also all sorts of different types of culture. So you can have a generational culture. People talk about that, Gen Y or whatever. These people have been brought up in a certain time. You've got something to do with gender. You've got ethnicity. You've got ability or disability. You've got then your socio-economic class. That's something that actually has been a bit neglected, but I think when I go to UK, I find very important there is not so much your ethnic background, but a sort of class background that you might come from that may be unspoken. So many of those things make up culture, and this, to understand what's happening in a situation, you need to understand then the individual, these different types of culture, and the situation that you find yourself in. So are you dealing with a customer, or are you dealing with a friend? Are you dealing with a buyer or a seller? All those things influence how people behave. So let's not just focus on one element of this, which is the national culture. That's another reason, by the way, for removing these nationalities from my critical instance that you mentioned.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Actually, I have just finished reading a fantastic book by Hans Rosling, Factfulness. And he writes over there that actually this socioeconomic aspect is something that is such a taboo theme that one has to consider it much, much more, that in many cases it plays a much more important role than religion, country of origin, and so on and so forth. So this is also something that is slowly entering the whole discussion in the diversity inclusion field much more about intercultural field as well.
Yep.
And when I remember also our meetings at different theater conferences in different European countries, I cannot resist this impression that whenever you have your audience, you are trying to bridge this distance between the listeners and you with the stories. How do you actually do it?
Actually, yeah, you've actually helped me in the past by one comment that you made, a very nice comment, which was saying that I was a great storyteller. I didn't realize I was telling stories, but then I thought about, when do I tell stories? And one occasion when I do tell stories is when sometimes I give a presentation. So sometimes maybe you have the same experience, you get invited just maybe for not very long, but just to give like 1 hour or half an hour or at a conference thing. And you have to sort of try to establish some rapport with the audience quite quickly. You don't have a lot of time. And there was a time when I was doing this quite a lot, actually, and a long time ago. I remember one time which was extremely powerful, where I was trying to make a bridge with a completely unknown audience. I had no idea. I had never met any of them before, and I was coming in very cold. And it was in Berlin, and shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I was employed by various people to give talks about, at that time, language teaching and about so-called Landeskunde, so cultural studies. And I was asked by a publisher to give a talk in Berlin. The talk actually was in West Berlin. Berlin was just about to be coming together, but the city was pretty divided. And I was very pleased, and I was happy and very interested to go to Berlin at that time. It was very exciting. And I had a friend, actually, who was a doctor, and he lived in East Berlin. He had lived there before the war, but he was a West German, but he worked in East Berlin in a very famous clinic. And I stayed with him, and we had a very nice breakfast and things. Then I said to him, I really must go now because I've got to give this talk, And I said, I would love to talk to you much more, and it's fascinating. And he said, I think the best thing if you do. I said, how do I get there? And he said, well, I think actually the best thing to do would just get a taxi. So a taxi came, and I got into this taxi, and I told the guy the address where I was speaking at this publisher's, and he didn't really react. He seemed a bit unfriendly, but he just drove around, and then he drove. I could see we were in West Berlin, and then just at one point he stopped. He said, that's where the journey ends. And I said, but this is not, this is not where I'm speaking. I can't see any sign of this building, and I've no idea. He said, I can't drive you any further. And I said, well, let's, I was a bit annoyed, but I thought I've got to actually get on with it because I need to get there. I was a bit late, So I said, come on, let's try and find this place together. And then eventually I had remembered I'd been there once before, roughly where it was, and he got me there. And I sort of felt a bit strange because it was quite a reaction. And then when I got out of the taxi, I thought, okay, but I don't know. It looked like he came from his car was very run down. I thought I'll just give him a tip. I always give taxi drivers a tip. And he was just amazed. And he said, oh, thank you very much. And then he started crying. And I said, are you okay? And he said, I'm not really okay. For me, it's very humiliating because I've been a taxi driver for 30 years in East Berlin, and I knew every street and every building. And now I'm faced with taking people like you to my own city, my own country, my own town, but I don't know any of the streets at all. It's a completely new world because before I couldn't get from East to West Berlin. I'd never been there. And he says, it's just awful. I feel so bad. And thank you for your understanding. And then he sort of hugged me, and I said, okay, don't worry. But it was a very moving thing. So that was an interesting experience. But I then started my talk to there's a group of teachers. And I opened with this anecdote. I said, you know what's just happened to me? And I wanted to make the point that when we talk about cultures, it's not just about national culture. So this guy, this taxi driver, he was German. He was a taxi driver, a very skilled taxi driver, and he was from Berlin. But he's still faced now with dealing with a completely different culture in his own town. And that was a very powerful anchor. And some of the people could identify with this sort of situation because they're coming to terms with the idea of these two parts which have grown up and for many years in different ways, bringing them together.
Yeah.
So that was a bridge, I felt, from my background coming from the outside to this issues that the people had in West and East Berlin at that time.
Yeah. Yeah, this is actually something that is very, very important when we work with stories. Yeah, and you have just brought an example how it worked perfectly. That we need to know the context. We need to know our listeners. The better we have the feeling for the atmosphere in the room, the better story we can also choose for this event. And the better we can imagine how people might react to the story, how they relate to it. This is also, this attempt that is very, very spread right now. It's getting more and more common to work with storytelling practices in the organizational area.
Yeah. That's actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's another area where I found it quite powerful. I mean, I was a bit suspicious when I was working in business when people said, oh, we're going to do some sort of training about storytelling. I thought, okay, this is not going to work in a corporate setting. It's all very hard-nosed and also a bit too soft. And we're going to talk about Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, whatever it is. But no, I found actually there were cases, again, maybe it wasn't so conscious, but where I ended up finding how powerful storytelling was. And an example of that was when I was involved with supporting an acquisition of a company. So the company I worked for, they took over a company in Austria. And as unfortunately often happens when there's rumors about a takeover or it begins to happen, sometimes people get a bit anxious, and in this case, people started leaving the company. It was the communication was maybe not so good about what was happening. So the ones who could, the talented people, they were just getting new jobs. It was an area where actually these engineers that I was working with, it was an engineering company, they were in short supply. And at that time, the whole of Eastern Europe was opening up. So they could get opportunities anywhere in Central and Eastern Europe, and they did. So this was a big concern for the company that acquired this Austrian company, because they're losing their best talent. And they said, we need to do something. So we had a team of people, and we did what often people do in this situation. We thought, well, we need to find out what the issues are. Why are the people unhappy? Why are they not staying? What are their concerns, and how do they see things? And so we did a questionnaire and sent it to all the employees, and some people responded, and we got the results. We still didn't really think that we had much to work on, because we thought, okay, this is very general, and you never quite know how people react to these questionnaires. And so we actually decided to interview people, and we asked the company to choose people more or less at random from different jobs and different levels of the company. And a colleague and I, we were going to go there for a few days, and we just had interviews with these people. My colleague and I, we thought, okay, how do we structure this interview? We need to have it. We ended up saying, actually, maybe it's best not to structure it at all. And what we ended up doing basically was saying to people, everybody had, like, I think it was half an hour or something. It wasn't such a long time, but just tell us your story. How have you experienced this? That makes it quite hard to document things and to do things. But from this, we actually found out a lot about what was happening. And we were, because it was driven not by us, but it was driven by the storyteller, by the employees. And it led to some great insights into what the issues were. But actually, the process of storytelling was so moving for one of the colleagues that I talked to, that and she said to me afterwards, she also was very emotional, and she said to me, "You're the first person who's listened to me since this takeover was announced, and thank you very much." And I heard that maybe 2 days later, she resigned from the company. She said, "I don't want to work there anymore." And she wrote to me and said that the storytelling had helped her to come to this conclusion about what she wanted as an individual. So that was quite a brave decision. It wasn't necessarily what the company wanted, but for that individual, this telling the story and being listened to was crucial for her development. I don't know what happened afterwards, but I felt it was quite a brave decision, but I think she needed some clarity in order to make that hard decision.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing, because it also shows how important it is to create such a safe space. And you have just said that it gave you much better idea how people actually are dealing, or not necessarily constructively dealing with the situation, under pressure with all these emotions, and also in this particular example with really very hard consequences. That it's not only about this aspect of telling the story, but also about feeling heard. Yeah. So the story listening aspect is also very important. And this is also something that brings immediately this association with empathetic listening, with compassion. So even going one step beyond. But also listening for understanding of someone's reasons and also arguments, but also for someone's emotions, and listening with the trial, at least, not to judge. So not to judge what I would do in this situation, how I would behave, but really, yes, just making it clear, I'm here for you to listen to your story.
That's actually something, if I might mention, that you reminded me again, hearing you say that, of an exercise that I used to do with people, which I was surprised how powerful it was. Probably you've done this as well, is just to get people, when you're talking about what does it mean to listen and so forth, is just get people work in maybe pairs, and then one person talks about whatever they want to talk about, and the other person is told to listen but not say anything. And sometimes we do this for, depends on the group how long you can do this, but 2 or 3 minutes seems quite a long time for people not to say anything. And that's quite powerful, because sometimes also people said, nobody's ever listened to me that long before. They normally we interrupt. Of course, we interrupt sometimes with good intention. We don't understand something, we want clarification. But often we interrupt, of course, as you know, just to get our point across, and not to really react to this person. So that to me showed the enormous power of non-judgmental listening, active listening, whatever you like to call it, how powerful that can be. And people who are not used to this sort of thing said that they found that actually a very useful thing to do, just to say, okay, I'm going to listen. It's very hard, because again, like we've said, when we listen to someone, it triggers all sorts of associations in our brain, and we want to share those, which is quite natural. But sometimes we need to, again, reflect on that listening process.
Exactly. And it's always this conscious decision, how much do I want to tell, and also how much do I want to listen to, so that it's not overwhelming for both sides. You have just mentioned this one activity. I recall also one very powerful practice that actually our common colleague, Joel Brown, once shared during the story listening workshop, where he invited us to again sit in couples, and the first person says, if you only knew me, you would know. And then just to finish the sentence, the other person is listening to it, One can add a couple of other sentences, but it's very, very quick.
Yeah.
And then people, change turns. And the second activity following afterwards is to say, right now you repeat it and you say something different. And it was extremely powerful because it was the moment when many people felt this psychological safety, safe space, and when they really shared something much more personal. So they had the chance to get to know each other at a different level. So this is also something that we need to be conscious about when we work with stories, that we need to always give this right to the people, how much they want to share, how much they want to listen to. And it brings me to my very last question. Whenever I have my guests joining One Word Stories, I ask them what word was actually such a magic word for them that supported them during the tough time, and what is the story behind?
Yeah, the one word for me is the word bridge or bridging, actually. And I think this is a very powerful word. For me, we've talked a bit about it in terms of the bridging between the listener and the speaker, like in a presentation. I see this also in my work with different cultures. I think it's not about just seeing differences or whatever, but it's about building bridges. That's the next step. After you're aware of similarities and differences, you need to make a connection and mediate between them. So I find this a very, very powerful word. And bridging, covers so many aspects of life. Bridging connections between people, between groups of people, between cultures. I think it works at any level. And it's actually, thinking about this word has made me quite fascinated with bridges when I go anywhere. And I was spent a lot of time in the Deutsches Museum in Munich recently. It's just reopened, and they have a department on a section on bridges. And I was looking at this. They've even built a special bridge in the room to take you there. And I find this is a very powerful, for me, a very powerful image in all times, not just difficult times, but in positive times too, because there are also around the world some very, very beautiful bridges which connect people. I think of a trip to Mostar, where there's a famous bridge which was destroyed during the conflict there, and now has been rebuilt and links two parts of the town, which are actually one is two parts of the town with completely different backgrounds, but it's that link between those two places. Was destroyed, is now rebuilt. So that's the word that I would like to share with you.
Thank you very, very much. I love your insights. I really like your book, which is really fantastic to work with students. What I'm doing currently is really to also work with your stories without, the W question, where the people are from, because it's very, very often this eye-opener, which is really a good reaction and good learning for the students to say, oh, actually, it fits in different categories, and it's so much about my reflection, my experience, and not really what the word is look like. Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me, and continue your great work on storytelling. Thanks.
Thank you.